Hello, world history. Today we are going to be talking about a time period during 1400 to 1800 known as the Reformation. So, when we look at the Reformation, we're really going to be looking at the difference between how religion functioned in medieval Europe versus how it functioned during the early modern period, especially after about 1500 and kind of in the 1500s, 1600s. So really we're going to be looking at the difference between in medieval Europe, we're going to have something called Christendom. Basically all of Europe was Christian, mostly. I mean, there were some pockets of Jews here and there, but for the most part, everybody was Christian and everybody was Roman Catholic. That wasn't, they wouldn't even necessarily think of themselves as Roman Catholic because it was just everybody. So it was just Christian. And so it was united under the Pope in Rome, and everybody was sort of in that same system. So we go from Christendom or Christ's kingdom, everybody being Catholic, to during the early modern period, we're going to have this breakdown during this time called the Reformation, where we go from everyone being Catholic to just these light yellow areas being Catholic, but then smatterings of Anglican and Calvinist and Lutheran, and then kind of mixes of things. So how do we get to this point where everybody is believing different things? Now, you'll notice basically all of them in continental Europe here, until you get too far over here, are still mostly Christian. So it's not that they changed from Christian to a different religion, but we're going to see a breakdown within Christianity into lots of different denominations. So let's talk about how this happened and why this happened. So first of all, it happened because there were some major problems in the Catholic Church at the time. And most people are going to recognize this even if they decided to stay with the Catholic Church. So some major problems that kept popping up, and not everybody would know about these, but the more in the know you were, the more you might have known this stuff was happening. So, for example, there were some problems with kind of general priests and then all the way up to the higher levels within the church. So instead of living a life of poverty, like some of the monks and some of the priests said they were going to, we have a lot of wealth being congregated into the church and congregated in individuals. So some people within the church are getting really wealthy, which people view as kind of problematic. We have a problem with celibacy being followed. So in the Catholic Church, to be a priest or to be a monk or a nun, there is this agreement with the church that you are basically, for monks and nuns, kind of marrying the church and agreeing to not have sex. And that's not happening at this point. Basically, we have a lot of cases where there's priests with a bunch of kids that are sort of illegitimate. We have cases where high-ranking members of the clergy are having kids, and then their kids are working their way up the system, which is kind of problematic on multiple levels. We also have cases where there's just problems with education of priests and education of people in church leadership, where there's local priests that just don't know how to read. They don't really understand the Bible. They don't really understand what they're supposed to be leading everybody in. So there's some cases where people are not being told things that the Catholic Church as a whole would agree with, just because there's not enough education for the priests themselves. And then we also have some cases of people selling church positions, and this would especially be higher up. So as you start working into bishop seats and stuff like that, where people with a lot of money end up with those seats. So people are giving positions in the church based on not how religious they are, or not based on other types of merit, but based on who they know and bribes and things like that. There's some cases of that. So most people are going to say that those are problems that were there at some level. There was some cleaning up to do. A problem that happened that was more right around this time period dealt with what's known as the selling of indulgences. So indulgences are these certificates that you can buy, and it's not just a certificate, it's what it means. And basically they're pardons offered by the church. Usually at this time it was to be relieved from time in purgatory, which is sort of, at the time, there's different thoughts within Christianity, for sure, there's a lot of variety, but the thought was that someone might not be ready to go straight to heaven after death. They might have to work off some of that time in kind of an in-between place called purgatory. And an indulgence could be a pardon to get out of purgatory early, or you could buy for someone else to get out of purgatory early. And they were being sold by the church during this time period, the early 1500s, as a fundraiser to raise money for that beautiful church we saw in the first slide, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in the Vatican itself. So some people are starting to have some questions about that. That doesn't seem to rub them quite the right way. So if the church could offer pardons, why wouldn't they just offer pardons for like out of mercy rather than to make money? So that kind of struck people some wrong ways. And lastly, anybody that spoke out against the church, there wasn't a good dialogue about, even asking questions about why things were. If anyone spoke out, a lot of times they were labeled a heretic, which was a pretty strong statement at the time. They were kind of kicked out of the church, essentially sentenced to hell would be what would happen, because if you weren't in the church, you couldn't go to heaven. And then in some cases, like that of Jan Hus and some other people like that, they're actually burned at the stake. Or sometimes it's just publicly mocked and humiliation, driven out of town. But it usually doesn't end very well for them if they stick to their original statements. So into that, we get the most famous person in the Reformation, which is a guy named Martin Luther. He's German, he's a monk, he's a scholar in a lot of ways, so he's working in a couple different places, but he kind of works as a professor slash scholar slash monk. He's doing a lot of different things at once, and he had a big issue with those indulgences as they were being sold. And he actually writes up a series of problems that he has with the Catholic Church. He has 95 main points, 95 theses. So 95 separate thesis statements of things that he sees as problematic. He nails them to the door of the local church. That's kind of like a community board of some sort. Everyone nailed stuff up there. And when he got called out on it, he was seen as a major threat, and they called him out on it. They put him on trial. And when that happened, he refused to step down. He said, I won't take it back. I won't recant because I think that it's true. And for that, he's excommunicated. And he actually does a lot of work. This basically sets off a whole bunch of people. He has a bunch of supporters because he's saying stuff that's kind of resonating with people at the time. So you have to think this is happening in the context of like the Renaissance. So people are starting to learn a little bit more. There's more focus on reading again. And a lot of his ideas are actually taken and then published on the printing press, and more people are reading them. So when he gets excommunicated by the church, some people are really upset. And he actually has to go into hiding for a series of years. And during that time, he takes some time and translates the Bible into the vernacular of his homeland. So he translates it into German so that German people can read it. And he really focuses on the fact that maybe people can challenge religious ideas, that idea of individualism and humanism, believing that anybody could read and understand the Bible instead of just priests. So this idea of questioning the establishment, which we're going to see again in the scientific revolution, the ideas of using the printing press like we saw in the Northern Renaissance and the vernacular. So there's a lot of overlap here, but the space that he was working in was the religious side of it and kind of the splitting of Christianity. Now, his goal was not to split the church. His goal was to reform the church, but that's not really what happens. It does split during his time period. So essentially, he's not the only one that's doing this. He's the one that kind of kickstarts a lot of it in the first successful way. But there's other people that some of you may have heard of. So like Calvin, he does a lot of stuff with Reformed churches. He's very influential in places like Geneva, Switzerland, in places like Scotland. He has different followings. People like Zwingli here on the other side. He's the precursor to a lot of Mennonite groups, Anabaptist groups. The Amish kind of come out of his teachings. Sometimes it's not quite as straightforward. So like in England, they have this thing called the Anglican Church, or in the United States, it's known as the Presbyterian Church. And it's more complicated than this, but essentially he creates the church to grant himself a divorce from his first wife because the Pope refused to do it. So he creates a new branch of Christianity to let him be remarried to someone else that he wanted to. So there's some interesting things there if you ever want to dive into that. So when we start talking about the Reformation, sometimes called the Protestant Reformation, when you look at the word Protestant, it's got that root protest. So Protestants are anyone that protests the Catholic Church during this time period. So they're people that have separated from the Catholic Church and created their own branch of Christianity. But they don't all agree. Like we're already seeing, there's all these different types up top. Some of them take more aggressive stances. Some of them, it's pretty much Catholic, just not under the Pope. That'd be like the Anglican Church at the time. So there's lots of different groups or denominations. So Baptists are a denomination, Lutherans are a denomination. There's all these different, Anglicans are a denomination. There's all these different groups, all called denominations. So far we've mostly been talking about religion, so you think it just deals with thoughts, but actually a lot of this led into like full out bloody wars. We're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people dying in a series of religious wars that basically racks this continent for decades. People fighting over which form of religion they're going to be following in their area, and people don't agree. And a lot of times it's the leader of that specific area, whether it's a province or a small little kingdom in what now is Germany or whatever it might be, and then they decide for their area, what are you going to be? So you still don't have a thing where everybody gets to just choose what religion they are or choose not to be religious. But we are seeing a breakdown of what the Catholic Church was allowed to do, and the extent that they were able to have influence, I guess, at this time period. Now, the Catholic Church doesn't stop there. In a lot of ways. So it's not just breaking away from the Catholic Church and then the Catholic Church just does what they've done all the time. The Catholic Church actually sees this as a chance to really dive in and clean up a lot of things. Like I said, basically everybody agreed that there was room for growth. And so there's this movement known as the Counter-Reformation that really focused on reform of the Catholic Church and renewal of the Catholic Church, and really trying to put in some of these ideas of the time period, the Renaissance learning, the individualism, the humanism, back into the Catholic Church. So the Counter-Reformation is the Catholic response, and a lot of this happens in this church council called the Council of Trent. They do a lot of things to clean up some of the problems. So they end indulgences. They're still on the books as being able to be issued, but they don't do it anymore after this point. They improve education, which is good. And then they kind of double down on Catholicism. So all these people are kind of going different ways, but they say if you're going to be Catholic, you have to go to church. It's just not optional. You have to read approved books. There's some people that are just teaching lies according to them. So works of people like Calvin and Luther, you can't read those. They create a new class of missionary monks known as Jesuits. So a lot of the Christian missionaries you're actually going to see at this time are Catholic. They are Jesuit missionaries. So when we've talked about Japan and China, when we go to the New World, a lot of the conversions are happening by Jesuits, which should make sense if you think about, like, most of Latin America is Catholic, and it's because of these new Jesuit monks. And lastly, there's these new churches that have a more emotional style that connect the individual more with the church, which is going to sound a lot more like what Luther was promoting. It's not all the way there, but it's definitely taking more of a lean towards what the general society was doing at the time. So in closing, there's a few different things that hopefully you're able to answer. So by the end of this, you should be able to talk about what were some of the problems in the medieval Catholic Church, how the Reformation started, how it reflected the early modern era, how is it similar to some of the other movements in this chapter. Think about things like the printing press is used, humanism comes up, we have the vernacular language being used, we focus on, individuals being willing to buck the establishment and kind of advocate for something that they think is right. We're going to see that multiple times. And then also be aware of how the Catholic Church responded. That idea of the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent as really fixing some of the problems from within instead of going outside and breaking away. So thank you. If you have any other questions, please talk to your world history teacher.